Brucey here with a new episode of Chordplay, and this is I Love 90s Blues Rock Chords. And I've always found it really interesting that there was a blues rock explosion or revival in the 90s, and it kind of parallels another blues rock explosion that happened in the late 60s and early 70s. And these parallels in music is really interesting when something comes back or there's a resurgence or an explosion, and it's happened a lot. And definitely the late 60s blues rock explosion was noticeably different in style and sound than the 90s blues rock explosion. But that's basically what this episode is going to talk about. Some of those 90s guitarists that took elements of blues and rock and funk and jazz and mixed it in their 90s blues rock music. So if you take a look at rock music history, it's very interesting that, Jimi Hendrix passed away in 1970. It was late in 1970, and immediately following Hendrix's death, there was an outpour of tributes and memorials, and people were really devastated. It was a huge loss in music. And, eventually Robin Trower, started to kind of cop some Hendrix, style and effects. What Eddie Hazel with Funkadelic was a loyal, Hendrix fan and follower. And eventually you had people like Randy Hansen, who literally became like another Hendrix, like Hendrix Part 2 or something. But then after Stevie Ray Vaughan died in August of 1990, and after his passing, a very similar event took place where there were tributes and memorials, and people started to play more like Stevie Ray Vaughan, and there was lots of guitarists that had the music note strap like Stevie Ray, and they started wearing the hats like him and stuff. And there was just a huge, outpour of, tributes and concerts and albums and stuff like that. And that really did kind of kick off this 90s blues rock explosion. So the music and examples in this episode were pulled from 6 different blues rock albums from the 90s, and there are hundreds of choices I could have, picked. Other players, other bands, other songs, and stuff like that. So I was a little overwhelmed because there's a lot. Once you dive into that 90s blues rock scene, there's a ton of music just hiding right there. Some of it's forgotten these days, it seems, and some of it's definitely remembered. But there's a whole bunch of great 90s blues rock to be found. The opening, that's the song My Way Down from Chris Duarte, and that came from his 90s album Texas Sugar Strat Magic, which is a brilliant album. And there's a lot happening with that rhythm part, but something like this. So it's just basically just jamming in C minor and C minor 7 loosely right there. And we're tuned down a half step, by the way. So we are tuned down a half step, and he's just, riffing out of C minor and C minor 7. And there's some thumb action, kind of grabbing the root note there. Like that. Single note, 2 notes, single note, 2 notes. Right? And then there's a lot of these partial chords on top and just mashed, bar chords. Like that. And there he's sliding, so he's kind of doing like the flat 5 action, but he's doing it like a chord. Happening right there. And right there you kind of start it again. And this is really interesting. That little fill's kind of funky, and then he over it kind of pronounces that whole riff. Like that, really cool. verse right there. But that's a really demanding guitar part, and I love the way Chris is just smearing and sliding all the way around, but it's basically just C minor 7. Next up is the song Sign of the Storm, and this came from Eric Gales, and this appears on his album The Eric Gales Band, which is a great album, and Eric's a great guitarist. And this is kind of a basic riff, but it rocks out like this. So we're still tuned down a half step, and we're in the key of A, and Eric's playing the open A off this G and A on the D string right there, and just kind of getting groovy and funky with it. And you hear this little fill. So it's like a G power chord, then walking down to F right there. That's kind of a weird little transition. Right back to that A riff. And the sliding riff. So that F into, that A. Grab that C and then end on a G5. And then loop that whole riff again. Next up is the song Born with a Broken Heart from Kenny Wayne Shepherd, and this appears on his album Ledbetter Heights, which was his debut. And this is this kind of scratch and sniff Texas blues riff. We're still tuned down a half step in the key of A, and Born with a Broken Heart, something like this. So we're in the key of A, and he's doing this scratchy, bouncy riff like this. So it's like a scratch, low E open, scratch, that G smeared scratch, and then the open A. And then you're basically playing this A minor 7 right there. Right, so the A, the C, the G, and then you're grabbing that C up on top too, like that. Into this D minor 9. Like that. You do 2 passes of that. Go back to A. You're going to go to the 5 chord, and that's E7. And then you hear this kind of bouncy walk up back to A. This is an extended kind of turnaround, like the next pass, something like this. Walk up just kind of moves you right back into A, and then you just repeat the whole thing again. Great song. Next up is the song Cell Block 7 from the band Bloodline, and this featured Smokin' Joe Bonamassa back when he was a teenager. And this song rocks. Actually, that Bloodline album rocks. That's a great overlooked album. Joe's just ripping all over the place back then. But Cell Block 7, something like this. so you got this big giant power chord opening E to a D, and then to a C, and just start bashing that C, and then a rock out riff right here. So you're kind of playing with this E, D, and C sharp right there. And I love that weird slide, you know, from that A to G sharp. And then you hear it totally get funked out right there, E9. And you still hear that A to G sharp up there. Something like that. Check that song out, and definitely check out that Bloodline album if you haven't heard it before, because you'll catch Bonamassa shredding back then. Next up is Highway Jones from the band Cry of Love, and this came from their album Brother, and this is Oddly Freed on guitar. And I did create a Chordplay episode for Cry of Love, I think that was last year, and also an Oddly Freed 3-for-All episode where I looked at some of his licks. You know, outstanding guitarist. And I wanted to include this again because Highway Jones rocks, Cry of Love's album Brother rocks, and so does Oddly Freed. But Highway Jones is something like this. So we're in C sharp minor 7 this time. You know, earlier we were in C minor 7, but we're in standard tuning for this too. But you hear this super funky Hendrixy riff. So C sharp minor 7 right there. So that's all C sharp minor 7 for the most part. You know, F sharp, the G sharp, the low E, the top 2 strings open, and then a series of little fills right there. That's the first one right there, those kind of Hendrixy, you know, R&B kind of double stop, and then do that first riff again. And then once again a Hendrixy riff right here, or a fill. That double stop, and then you're kind of smearing that bend into that E, and then start that C sharp minor 7 riff again. You got this really tasty fill. So, you know, E major pentatonic right there. You got that really aggressive kind of Hendrixy, you know, vibratoed E at the end. That C sharp minor 7 riff again. He just kind of plays with those R&B, you know, kind of Hendrixy double stops, and then ends and goes into the verse right there. But what a riff! That's awesome. Last but not least is Good Time from the Archangels, and this is Doyle Bramhall Jr. and Charlie Sexton on guitar, and Double Trouble's the rhythm section. You know, Stevie Ray Vaughan's band is backing up Archangels here. And Good Time is super funky. And when I first heard this song, it just stopped me in my tracks, and I bought the album. I was like, I want the album this song came from, because it just hit me. And you've got this super funky groove. It's all E right there. And then you hear Charlie Sexton sneak in with these little chords. So here's that funky riff. And then Charlie's part, he's picking chords here. You know, something like that. Basically like an A sus4 over E. But if you think of that related to E, that's kind of like an E7 sus4, I guess. So you got that A right there. But against that E riff, that's really, really cool. So during the interlude section from the same song, there's a really interesting funky guitar part like this. There's something weird happening there, but it's D, and we're kind of playing with the minor and major third right there. And then do the same thing in C, and then E. And there's something weird happening with both guitars. They're doing like two separate things, but that's kind of a, I guess, an imitation of what's going on there. And then do that D to C. There's a hesitation on that, you know, minor to major hammer on. And then do the first one again. Of the song, there's an interesting like riff or fill they put in there, so it's back to that funky riff we started with. So that little chromatic thing, I like that, it's really cool. And it just takes you right back to the riff. Alright, that's going to wrap this episode of Chordplay with I Love 90s Blues Rock Chords. And like I was mentioning earlier, you know, after Hendrix's passing, it caused a ripple, you know, in the music scene, in the music industry. Just like Stevie Ray Vaughan caused a ripple, you know, and it kind of changed or redirected, you know, certain musicians. They decided to pay tribute to him, or, you know, noticeably, a lot of people don't talk about this, but after, you know, Hendrix died, Clapton suddenly started using a Fender Stratocaster. Keep in mind, he was playing Gibson Les Pauls and SGs before that. But then somewhere around 1970, that's where he made the Stratocaster shift. And then after Stevie Ray Vaughan, it seemed like everybody was playing beat up, you know, Sunburst Stratocasters. I mean, mine's a little bit beat up. And I did buy this technically in 1996. So I bought a Stratocaster Sunburst, you know, in the 90s. But it wasn't really because of Stevie Ray Vaughan or any of this activity that we've looked at. I just liked this guitar. I just thought it looked cool and classic. But it's really interesting when this happens. Of course, most recently, you know, Eddie Van Halen and Jeff Beck and some of the legends that have recently passed, similar things have happened. Obviously, people have run out and bought, you know, Van Halen guitars and Jeff Beck, you know, signature guitars and albums and stuff. And I think I read somewhere after Stevie Ray Vaughan died, like the months following his passing, they sold 5.5 million copies of his music or albums, just in a few months after he died. And that happens. Obviously, there's huge spikes in album sales and instrument sales. And it's really hard, when a legendary guitarist passes. But then I think it's really inspiring to notice what musicians do after those legends pass away, which is what we looked at in this episode. So anyway, leave some feedback and comments. Please subscribe to Night Lessons, and I'll be back before you know it with more content and material. Thank you.